Why did my girlfriend believe her therapist friend instead of calling 911 when I started having seizures? The first seizure hit me during dinner at Kara's apartment. One moment, I was cutting into chicken parmesan, and the next, my entire body locked rigid, and I crashed sideways out of my chair onto the hardwood floor. My jaw clenched so tight, I bit through my tongue and blood filled my mouth. I could hear Kara screaming my name, but I couldn't respond because every muscle in my body was contracting violently and involuntarily. The convulsions slammed my head against the floor repeatedly, and I felt my consciousness fragmenting into jagged pieces. Through the chaos, I heard Kara on the phone with someone saying, "He's having some kind of episode, what should I do?" and a female voice responding calmly from the speaker. Kara's friend Simone was a therapist who specialized in trauma and anxiety disorders, and apparently that made her qualified to diagnose neurological emergencies over FaceTime. Simone's voice came through steady and authoritative, explaining that I was probably experiencing a panic attack manifesting as psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. She said these episodes looked dramatic but weren't dangerous, and that calling an ambulance would just traumatize me further by reinforcing the belief that something was physically wrong. Kara asked if she should call 911 anyway, because I was bleeding from my mouth and wasn't responding. Simone said the blood was probably from biting my cheek during the episode, and that I needed to be allowed to come out of it naturally without interference. The seizure lasted maybe 90 seconds, but felt infinite. When it finally stopped, I lay on the floor completely disoriented, with no memory of falling or convulsing. My muscles ached and my head throbbed, and I could taste copper in my mouth. Kara knelt beside me with her phone still on speaker and Simone's voice asking how I was doing. I tried to say I needed a hospital, but my words came out slurred and confused. Simone explained to Kara that post-episode confusion was normal with psychogenic seizures and that I needed calm reassurance rather than medical intervention. She said taking me to the ER would validate what she called my catastrophic thinking patterns and make future episodes more likely. Kara helped me onto the couch while Simone walked her through grounding techniques and breathing exercises. I kept trying to explain that something was seriously wrong, but Kara kept saying, "It's okay, you're safe, you just had a panic attack." The way she said it with such certainty made me doubt my own perception. Maybe I was having panic attacks that felt like seizures. Maybe I was being dramatic. But the rational part of my brain knew that panic attacks didn't make you convulse and lose consciousness and bleed from biting through your own tongue. I insisted on going to the hospital, but Kara said Simone had advised against it. She explained that Simone had seen dozens of clients with psychogenic seizures and knew exactly how to handle them. I asked what qualified a therapist to diagnose neurological conditions, and Kara got defensive, saying Simone had years of clinical experience and specialized training in somatic symptoms. I pointed out that somatic symptoms were psychological manifestations, not actual seizures, and Kara accused me of being resistant to mental health treatment. The argument went in circles until I was too exhausted to keep fighting. Kara made me chamomile tea and put on a nature documentary, while Simone stayed on the phone giving instructions about monitoring my anxiety levels. I fell asleep on the couch and woke up 3 hours later, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Every muscle hurt, and my head felt like it was splitting open. Kara was asleep in her bedroom, and her phone was charging on the kitchen counter. I considered calling an Uber to take myself to the ER, but I could barely stand without my legs shaking. I took 4 ibuprofen and went back to sleep, telling myself I'd go to a doctor in the morning if I still felt bad. The second seizure happened 5 days later while I was at work. I was a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company, and I'd been in a meeting with my team when suddenly my vision tunneled, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I tried to excuse myself, but before I could stand, my body went rigid again, and I collapsed forward onto the conference table. My coworkers later told me I convulsed for over 2 minutes while they called 911 and tried to keep me from hitting my head on the table edge. I have no memory of any of it. I woke up in an ambulance with a paramedic asking me questions I couldn't quite process. They took me to County General where doctors ran a CT scan and blood tests and started me on IV fluids. The ER physician said I'd had a tonic-clonic seizure and needed to see a neurologist immediately for further evaluation. She asked if I'd had any previous episodes, and I told her about the seizure at Kara's apartment 5 days earlier. The doctor's expression turned serious, and she asked why I hadn't come to the hospital after the first one. I explained that my girlfriend's friend, who was a therapist, had said it was just a panic attack. The doctor said that was dangerously incorrect advice and that untreated seizures could indicate brain tumors, strokes, infections, or epilepsy. Kara arrived at the hospital an hour later, looking upset and scared. She asked what had happened, and I explained about the seizure at work and what the ER doctor had said. Kara immediately called Simone on speakerphone right there in the hospital room. Simone's voice came through calm and slightly condescending, explaining that ER doctors were trained to rule out worst-case scenarios and often over-medicalize psychological issues. She said the tests they'd run were probably unnecessary and that I should get a second opinion from someone who understood the connection between anxiety and physical symptoms. The ER doctor walked in during this conversation and asked who was on the phone. Kara said it was her friend who was a licensed therapist. The doctor said firmly that therapists were not qualified to diagnose or treat seizure disorders and that I needed neurological care immediately, not psychological counseling. Simone started arguing that the medical establishment often dismissed psychogenic seizures, and the doctor cut her off, saying, "This patient had a witnessed tonic-clonic seizure at his workplace. This is not a mental health issue. This is neurology." She asked Kara to end the call, and Kara reluctantly hung up, looking conflicted. The neurologist I saw 2 days later was a woman named Dr. Yolanda Reeves, who specialized in epilepsy. She reviewed my ER records and ordered an EEG to measure my brain's electrical activity. The test involved attaching electrodes all over my scalp and having me lie still while machines recorded my brainwaves. Dr. Reeves also had me hyperventilate and look at flashing lights to see if they triggered seizure activity. The EEG showed abnormal electrical patterns in my temporal lobe consistent with epilepsy. Dr. Reeves explained that I had focal epilepsy that was progressing to generalized tonic-clonic seizures. She said this was a serious neurological condition that required immediate treatment with anti-seizure medication. Without treatment, I was at risk for status epilepticus, which meant continuous seizures that could cause permanent brain damage or death. She asked again about the first seizure and why I hadn't sought medical care. I explained the whole situation with Simone and her diagnosis of psychogenic seizures. Dr. Reeves looked disturbed and said that delaying treatment for epilepsy by 5 days because someone without medical training had given incorrect advice was potentially life-threatening. She said, if I'd had another seizure before getting to the hospital, I could have died. I started anti-seizure medication that day, but Dr. Reeves warned it would take weeks to reach therapeutic levels in my bloodstream. Until then, I was at high risk for more seizures. She told me not to drive, not to swim alone, not to use power tools, and to avoid alcohol and sleep deprivation. She also said I needed to educate the people around me about seizure first aid because the next one could happen anywhere. When I got home, I tried to explain all this to Kara, but she seemed skeptical. She said Dr. Reeves might be overdiagnosing to justify expensive medications, and that Simone had mentioned how pharmaceutical companies influence doctors. I asked if she seriously thought a neurologist with 15 years of experience was lying about my diagnosis. Kara said she wasn't saying the doctor was lying, just that there might be psychological factors the doctor wasn't considering. I pointed out that the EEG had shown actual physical abnormalities in my brain, and Kara said EEGs could be misread. The conversation was surreal. My girlfriend was arguing against medical evidence because her therapist friend had planted doubts. I called my parents, who lived 6 hours away, and told them everything. My mother was furious that Kara had stopped me from getting medical care after the first seizure. She said Kara's friend had no business giving medical advice and that I could have died because of the delay. My father, who was a pharmacist, said anti-seizure medications were serious drugs with serious side effects, and if I needed them, then I genuinely had epilepsy, not anxiety. They both urged me to reconsider my relationship with Kara if she was going to prioritize her friend's opinions over actual medical professionals. I defended Kara, saying she'd been scared and had trusted someone she thought was qualified. But privately, I was starting to realize that Kara's loyalty to Simone was overriding her common sense. Over the next week, I had 3 more seizures despite the medication. Dr. Reeves adjusted my dosage and added a second medication. She said my epilepsy was proving harder to control than expected, and we might need to try several medication combinations before finding what worked. Each seizure left me exhausted and disoriented and increasingly scared. Kara was there for 2 of them, and both times she called Simone immediately, instead of timing the seizure or checking if I was breathing properly. After the 3rd seizure, I sat Kara down and told her she needed to stop consulting Simone about my medical condition. I explained that Simone's advice had already delayed my diagnosis and could have killed me. Kara got defensive, saying Simone was just trying to help and had my best interests at heart. I said Simone's intentions didn't matter if her advice was medically dangerous. Kara accused me of being close-minded about alternative perspectives on health. I asked what alternative perspective existed for seizures caused by abnormal electrical activity in the brain. She said Western medicine didn't have all the answers, and that Simone had helped dozens of clients with similar symptoms through therapy alone. I asked if any of those clients had actually had their brains scanned, or if Simone was just assuming their symptoms were psychological. Kara couldn't answer. The conversation ended with both of us frustrated and angry. That night, Kara stayed at Simone's apartment, and I was alone when I had another seizure. I woke up on the bathroom floor with a gash on my forehead from hitting the sink. Blood had pooled under my head, and I had no idea how long I'd been unconscious. I managed to call 911 myself and was taken back to the ER. The ER doctor who treated me was the same one from my first visit. She recognized me and asked why I was still having breakthrough seizures. I explained that Dr. Reeves was adjusting my medications, but they hadn't reached therapeutic levels yet. The doctor stitched up my forehead and said I was lucky I hadn't had a more serious injury. She asked if I was living alone, and I said no, but my girlfriend had been staying with a friend. The doctor said I needed someone with me at all times until my seizures were controlled because the next fall could crack my skull or cause a brain bleed. She also asked if the person who'd given me the initial advice about psychogenic seizures was still involved in my care. I admitted that my girlfriend still consulted her friend despite my objections. The doctor looked at me seriously and said, "You need to understand that the advice you received after your first seizure was not just wrong, it was negligent. If your girlfriend continues to prioritize her friend's opinions over medical professionals, she's putting your life at risk." She gave me a pamphlet about epilepsy support groups and urged me to connect with other people who understood what I was going through. Kara came to pick me up from the ER with Simone in tow. Simone walked into my room without asking and introduced herself as if we were meeting socially. She said she wanted to talk about my treatment plan and see if there were ways to incorporate therapeutic approaches alongside medication. I told her I didn't need therapeutic approaches for a neurological condition. Simone smiled in a way that felt patronizing and said, "I understand you're feeling defensive, but there's significant research showing that stress and trauma can manifest as seizure-like episodes even in people with abnormal EEGs. I asked if she had medical training in neurology, and she said no, but she had extensive clinical experience with psychosomatic conditions. I told her to get out of my room. Kara looked shocked and said I was being rude. I said Simone had no business being at the hospital and no right to question my neurologist's treatment. Simone left, but not before telling Kara that my hostility was probably a side effect of the medications affecting my mood. The gaslighting was so blatant I almost laughed. This woman had nearly gotten me killed with her wrong diagnosis, and now she was suggesting my medications were making me paranoid. The relationship with Kara deteriorated rapidly after that. She couldn't understand why I was so angry at Simone when Simone was just trying to help. I couldn't understand how Kara could still defend someone whose advice had put me in danger. We had the same argument repeatedly until I finally said I couldn't be with someone who valued her friend's opinions over my actual safety. Kara cried and said I was making her choose between me and Simone. I said I wasn't making her choose. I was telling her that if she wanted to be with me, she needed to accept that I had epilepsy and trust my doctors, not her therapist friend. Kara said she needed time to think and went back to Simone's apartment. 3 days later, she texted saying she thought we should take a break. She said she couldn't be in a relationship with someone who was so closed off to holistic approaches to health, and that maybe we wanted different things. I read the text multiple times trying to understand how we'd gotten here. My girlfriend was breaking up with me because I wouldn't let her friend override my neurologist. The absurdity was almost funny, except it was actually happening. My seizures finally stabilized after 6 weeks on a combination of 3 different medications. Dr. Reeves said I could cautiously return to normal activities, but needed to avoid known triggers and maintain strict medication compliance. She also said I should consider the stress of my recent breakup as a potential seizure trigger and make sure I had adequate support systems. I'd moved back in with my parents temporarily because Dr. Reeves had insisted I couldn't live alone until the seizures were controlled. My mother was furious about the whole situation with Kara and Simone. She wanted to file a complaint against Simone with the state licensing board for practicing outside her scope. My father researched the legal requirements for filing such complaints and discovered that Simone's advice could potentially be considered reckless endangerment if it could be proven that she knew or should have known her recommendations were medically inappropriate. I wasn't sure I wanted to pursue legal action, but my mother insisted that Simone needed to face consequences so she wouldn't do the same thing to someone else. I joined an epilepsy support group that met weekly at a community center. Hearing other people's stories helped me feel less alone. One man described having his first seizure while driving and crashing his car into a telephone pole. A woman talked about being fired from her teaching job because her employer considered her epilepsy a liability. Another member described her family refusing to believe her diagnosis and insisting she was having spiritual attacks that needed prayer, not medication. The common thread was that epilepsy was widely misunderstood and people often faced skepticism from those closest to them. When I shared my story about Kara and Simone, the group responded with a mixture of outrage and recognition. Several people had similar experiences with partners or family members who'd trusted alternative practitioners over neurologists. The group facilitator, who was a social worker, said medical gaslighting was a serious problem in chronic illness communities and that people with invisible disabilities often had to fight to have their conditions taken seriously. 3 months after my diagnosis, I received a letter from Simone's attorney threatening legal action if I continued to defame and harass his client. Apparently, Kara had told Simone that I was blaming her for my medical issues, and Simone was concerned about damage to her professional reputation. The letter demanded I cease all negative communications about Simone and retract any statements I'd made to third parties. I took the letter to a lawyer who specialized in medical malpractice. She reviewed everything, including my medical records, the timeline of events, and the accounts from witnesses at my workplace. The lawyer said I had a strong case for a negligence claim against Simone because her advice had directly led to a delay in treatment for a life-threatening condition. She explained that while Simone wasn't a medical doctor, she'd presented herself as having expertise in diagnosing seizures and had given specific medical advice that contradicted emergency protocols. The fact that she'd done this over the phone without examining me made it even more egregious. The lawyer said she'd be happy to represent me if I wanted to pursue a civil suit, and that Simone's threatening letter was probably an attempt to intimidate me into silence before I could file a complaint. I filed a formal complaint with the State Board of Behavioral Health examining Simone's conduct. The complaint detailed how she'd diagnosed me with psychogenic seizures without examination, advised against emergency medical care, and continued to interfere with my treatment after I'd been diagnosed with epilepsy by a neurologist. I included medical records showing the delay in treatment and statements from Dr. Reeves about the potential consequences of that delay. The board acknowledged receipt of the complaint and said they'd open an investigation. Simone's attorney sent another threatening letter, but my lawyer responded with a detailed explanation of why my complaint was legally protected and factually accurate. Several weeks later, I received a call from a board investigator who wanted to interview me about the incident. I walked her through everything that had happened, and she took detailed notes. She said several other people had filed complaints about Simone giving medical advice outside her scope of practice, and that there was a pattern of behavior that concerned the board. Kara reached out 5 months after our breakup asking if we could meet to talk. I was hesitant but curious about what she wanted to say. We met at a coffee shop, and she looked different somehow. Thinner and tired with dark circles under her eyes. She apologized for not taking my diagnosis seriously and said she'd spent the past few months in therapy with a different counselor who'd helped her understand how Simone had manipulated both of us. Kara explained that Simone had positioned herself as the only person who truly understood psychology and health and had systematically undermined Kara's trust in medical professionals. The new therapist had identified this as a pattern of control and had helped Kara recognize how Simone's influence had damaged our relationship. Kara said she felt terrible about what had happened and wished she could go back and call 911 that first night. I appreciated the apology, but told her I wasn't interested in getting back together. Too much had happened, and I couldn't trust her judgment about health issues. Kara said she understood and just wanted me to know she was sorry. She also mentioned that she'd stopped being friends with Simone after learning about the board investigation. The board investigation concluded 8 months after I filed the complaint. Simone received a formal reprimand and was required to complete additional ethics training. The board found that she'd engaged in conduct outside her scope of practice by diagnosing and treating a medical condition without proper training or licensure. However, they stopped short of suspending or revoking her license. I was disappointed by what felt like a slap on the wrist, but my lawyer explained that proving serious harm in these cases was difficult because I'd ultimately received treatment and recovered. She said the reprimand would be on Simone's permanent record and would come up if anyone searched her license status. It wasn't the justice I'd hoped for, but it was something. The civil lawsuit moved more slowly. Simone's insurance company offered a small settlement to avoid trial, but my lawyer advised rejecting it because we had a strong case for significant damages. She said we could prove both the delay in treatment and the ongoing costs of my epilepsy care, which would be lifetime expenses. The case went to trial 18 months after my first seizure. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected and less dramatic than what you see on television. My lawyer presented medical testimony from Dr. Reeves explaining how the 5-day delay in treatment had allowed my epilepsy to progress and potentially made it harder to control. She also presented testimony from the ER doctor who'd treated me after both the second and fourth seizures. The doctor explained that immediate medical care after a first-time seizure was critical for diagnosis, and that Simone's advice to avoid the ER was dangerous and contrary to all medical protocols. Simone's attorney argued that she'd been trying to help and had acted in good faith based on her clinical training. He suggested that I might have had psychogenic seizures initially that later developed into epilepsy or that the two conditions coexisted. Dr. Reeves shut down this argument by explaining that the EEG patterns indicated I'd had epilepsy for some time before diagnosis and that there was no evidence of psychogenic seizures. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding Simone liable for negligence and awarding me damages covering medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering. Simone appealed the verdict, but it was upheld by a higher court. The legal victory felt hollow because nothing could undo the damage or erase the trauma of those first few months. I'd stabilized on medications, but still had breakthrough seizures occasionally and had to accept that I'd be managing this condition for the rest of my life. I'd also had to accept that someone I'd trusted had prioritized her friend's ego over my safety. The epilepsy support group helped me process the anger and grief. Other members shared their own stories of betrayal and medical trauma, and we supported each other through the ongoing challenges of living with seizures. I started dating again cautiously and was upfront about my epilepsy from the beginning. Some people were uncomfortable with it, and that was fine. I needed someone who could handle emergencies calmly and trust medical professionals when something went wrong. 2 years after my diagnosis, I was seizure-free for 6 consecutive months. Dr. Reeves said this was excellent progress and meant the medications were working well. She warned that I'd need to stay on them indefinitely and that any attempt to stop taking them could trigger more seizures. I'd made peace with that reality. I'd also made peace with what had happened with Kara and Simone. The anger had faded into something more distant and manageable. I'd learned that some people would prioritize their own beliefs over evidence and that I couldn't control that. What I could control was who I allowed into my life and who I trusted with my health and safety. The epilepsy had taught me to advocate fiercely for myself and to walk away from relationships that compromised my well-being. Simone had lost her appeal and paid the judgment, though her insurance covered most of it. The money didn't matter as much as the validation that what she'd done was wrong and had consequences. She'd apparently moved to another state and was working in a different field. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, but I doubted it. People who believed they were always right rarely changed even when proven catastrophically wrong. 3 years post-diagnosis, I was living independently again and working at a new tech company that was supportive of my medical needs. I disclosed my epilepsy during the interview process, and they'd been completely professional about accommodations. My seizures were rare now, maybe one every few months, and I'd learned to recognize the warning signs that meant I needed to sit down and get to a safe place. I wore a medical alert bracelet and had seizure first aid information programmed into my phone. The people closest to me knew what to do if I had a seizure, and more importantly, they knew to call 911 if anything seemed wrong. I'd built a support system of people who respected medical expertise and didn't try to substitute their own judgment for doctors. That was the real lesson from everything that had happened. Trust the people who'd spent decades learning medicine, and be very careful about who you trust with your life. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.